Babysitters. Was there a time you had to call the police on the parents of the child you babysat? If so, what happened? Content warning. If you haven't guessed already from the prompt, these stories are going to contain instances of some pretty messed up abuse, some of the S variety. I would watch my aunt's friends' kids from time to time. I was surprised the first day I met them because they were relatively old, 12 and 15, considering the fact that I was just 18. The cool thing about the low age difference was that we had a lot in common, and I really liked being around them. After a few times babysitting them, the older brother comes crying to me saying that he needs to talk, his shirt covered in blood. Apparently, he's been self-harming for a long time, and this time he cut too deep. I started panicking and immediately called my friend who recently became a nurse. I listened, and I started shaking and feeling sick as I was hearing the horrific story of how his mother would molest him and how his dad had been physically abusing him as a punishment for seducing his wife. We then went to my friend's apartment where we called the police right away, and she took care of his arm, thank God nothing too bad. The mom later tried to sue me for kidnapping her kids, but a few months later she and her husband were sent to prison. I don't know where they are now. I just know that the two kids are safe, live with relatives, and sometimes come over at my apartment to play video games and do homework. Thank you guys for all the awards and the nice comments. That is absolutely horrifying to hear, but I'm glad you were able to help them. Those kids were lucky to have you around, and I'm glad they are in a better place now. I didn't call the police, but I came very close. There was a little boy that I babysat for as a teenager, every Friday of every other week, as no one could handle him. His grandma once showed up at a restaurant and gave him back to his parents when she watched him. He was always pretty good for me, mainly because I would let him marathon Bob the Builder. Anyway, one night I'm making him macaroni and cheese and he's playing in the living room. His parents had been gone a couple hours and it had just gotten dark out. I had put the water on the stovetop and Andy was narrating his game for me from the living room when suddenly a door in the kitchen opened and a man I had never seen before walked out of the basement and into the kitchen. He was dirty, scraggy hair, and freaky skinny. I immediately screamed and threw the not yet hot water at him. He started screaming and yelled that he was Andy's uncle and he lived in the basement. He stormed back into the basement, and I called the boy's parents who told me that the man was in fact the dad's brother who had just been released from prison and was living in the basement. They hadn't felt comfortable leaving him alone with their 3-year-old as he had been convicted of violent crimes. So they thought it would be better if I, a skinny 15-year-old girl, was there as an intermediary. I called my dad, who came and spent the next 5 hours with me until they got home. I'm not sure the conversation they had while I was waiting in the car, but I didn't babysit for them again for a long time. Alrighty, there's food in the fridge. Feel free to help yourself. His bath time is at 7 p.m. No sugar after 6. He's violent convict uncles in the basement. I'm sorry, what was that last part? Huh? Oh, nothing, gotta go! I called family services, if that counts. I started babysitting for a newly single mother. She just moved into an apartment with her 3 kids, so things were understandably, at the time anyway, a total mess. Bare mattresses on the floor, clothes in piles, no food in the cupboards, the only furniture was a couch and her bed. At first, I was sympathetic. I only watched her kids for her to work as a server in the evening, and she expressed how hard she was trying to get her life together. But nothing changed at all as the weeks went by. Then she started coming in way later than when I knew the restaurant was closed, visibly messed up on drugs and alcohol. The last time I watched her daughters, she stumbled in the wee hours of the morning, vomiting completely out of her head, showing off a fresh tattoo, while earlier that same evening I genuinely struggled to find enough food to satisfy all 3 kids. I was so sad and overwhelmed. She was paying me so well, but I realized even at 17 years old, that was called hush money. I couldn't hush. I ran into the kids in a grocery a few years later with their dad and grandma, where they told me they had been living since they saw me last. They gave me hugs and looked so happy and healthy. No one but my mom ever knew about my involvement. Good on you. That can't have been an easy call to make, and I'm sure you were worried about what would happen to the kids. Still, you did the right thing, and everything seems to have worked out. My mom ran a day home when I was 5 or 6. One of the kids, who was a few years older than me, kept trying to play a game with other kids where they get naked under the covers. He also kept crapping his pants like every day. My parents talked to him about it and wound up calling the equivalent of Child Protective Services on the parents. It turned out his mom's new boyfriend was molesting him basically every day. It broke my parents' hearts. I'm not sure what happened to him after that. I hope he's doing okay. When I was young, my babysitter had to call the police twice. Once because my mom, who had limited visits with us 3 kids, came banging on her door to get us and take us to who knows where. Babysitter hid us in a closet and called the cops. Second time was when we were playing hide and seek in the apartment courtyard and my brother took hide and seek a little too seriously. He refused to come out from his hiding spot, and then some person said they saw him leaving with a strange man. Finally, after the cops showed up, he came out from under some bushes, proud that not even the cops could find him. Yikes. Well, at least that was the best possible ending to that last story. Not the cops, but an ambulance. My husband's cousin had just moved in an apartment down the road from me. She had 2 kids, both daycare age. One morning she called me and asked if I could watch little baby boy. She then proceeded to tell me the older one would be going to daycare, but baby had a bit of a cold and daycare wouldn't allow him there. I said sure. 10 minutes later, she showed up with him. He was sleeping at the time. She told me he had just eaten and would sleep for a bit. I was fine with that. She left immediately after no meds, no directions. I had a 1.5-year-old, so I had supplies. I felt his head, and he was hot. I took his temp, and it was high, way higher than it should be, so I called her work before cell phones. And I got her on the phone, proceeded to tell her this baby is sick, very sick. He needs to go to the E-room. She refused. I called our grandmother and told her what was going on and called her dad. The whole time, this baby hasn't moved, and I'm starting to panic. My uncle told me to call the hospital and call an ambulance. Uncle called Mom and finally got her to acknowledge how sick he was. He was in intensive care for almost a month and almost died. Because of the lack of oxygen, he has learning disabilities and pretty much will never be on his own. His mother blamed vaccines. Because of the situation, CPS then had to do a wellness check on my home. I will never forgive her for what she did to that baby and how he could have died in my care. I'm glad that you didn't listen to that mother. I am sure it must have stemmed from a worry about the cost of a hospital visit, but when it comes to your kids, especially a baby, you don't take chances like that. The fact that she is blaming vaccines instead of realizing she effed up just makes me mad. Years ago, I babysat 2 kids, 10 and 7. The 10-year-old was threatening us and threw his little sister out of the house. I followed and he locked us both out. Wisconsin winter, no shoes. It was near home, so I brought the girl to my place but couldn't leave a crazy kid alone. So I returned and he let me stay with him until parents returned. This was before cell phones. I was paid $1 an hour tops, no apology, no sugary sodas, no maraschino cherries in the door of the fridge. Parents were wealthy. A couple years later, the boy set fire to himself. I regret not doing more, but honestly, I'll never understand why his parents didn't do more. I didn't exactly call the police myself, but I was once babysitting for a single mom who had a 3/4-year-old. She was at a strange stage of life, but was essentially house-sharing a council estate-type house with a single dad. They weren't involved together, just housemates. He had 2 kids as well, 6 and 8 approximately. This guy was around while I babysat because I guess they had an agreement that they didn't look after each other's kids. He was nice and offered me food, although I'm pretty sure he was a bit of an alcoholic. At about 10 p.m., the mom of the 2 kids turned up off her head drunk or high, and just starts to scream and shout at the dad. She's ranting and raving about something or other and hitting him, acting like an actual maniac. She was completely crazy. I just grabbed the 2 kids that I wasn't babysitting and took them into the room with the girl I am babysitting to shelter. The mom keeps at it for a while until the dad eventually manages to shut her in a room and calls the police. They came to deal with it, I gave a statement, and that was that. It was really sad because the 2 little kids acted as if it was no big deal and they were used to it. I was pretty horrified. I didn't go back. I've been babysitting since I was 12, worked in daycare, and I'm currently a nanny. I've called the police on a family I babysat twice. I've also filed a couple of CPS reports, but in my experience, those didn't go anywhere. First time I called the police was because the child's mother didn't come home. She was supposed to be home by 1 a.m., but just never came back. Parents are late a lot, so it wasn't that big of a deal until the sun started rising. Grandma picked up the baby, and the cops found Mommy passed out drunk by some bar. She did not hire me again. Second time was because when I was changing a diaper, it was clear the toddler had been assaulted. I'm not going to say how, but it was obvious. I almost think her dad wanted me to see this because he was still there when I called the police, and it was just so obvious. It was a total crap show. Unfortunately, the child's mother got custody even though she definitely enabled the behavior. Dad was arrested at least. Anyone who can do that to their own child, any child, just they don't feel human to me anymore. That is just such monstrous behavior, and it makes me sick. Glad there are at least folks like you making those calls and turning those monsters in. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day. Don't know if this counts, but I used to work at a summer camp when I was a teenager. About once a week, we would all walk down the street to the community outdoor pool. There were 2 girls, 5 and 8, who were very shy and stuck to themselves a lot. We only had them for about 3 days at this point. I tried to include them in games, but it was like they didn't see anyone around them and just lived in their own bubbles. One day when we were getting ready to go to the pool, I was helping some of the younger kids put sunscreen on their backs. I remember asking the younger girl if I could help her, and she nodded. When I lifted up the back of her shirt to get her shoulder, she was absolutely covered in bruises and what I guessed were cigarette burns. Every inch of her back. It was the most horrifying thing I'd seen at that point in my life. I was 16 myself, so I went to my boss and showed her the girl's back. Her older sister was exactly the same. We ended up calling the police, and they came and got the girls that afternoon. The shape of the bruises almost looked like whip marks, like they were whipped with a belt until it left insane bruises. It was so sad. Never saw those girls again. My mom used to babysit when I was younger. She watched these 2 boys that lived across the street from us, and it was obvious from the start that the younger was the favored brother and the older one had some developmental setbacks and was not treated as nicely. I was 8 at the time, and these boys were 4 and 5. One morning they were dropped off, and Mom noticed that the older one was pretty bruised up. I mean, they were rough and tumble kids and always had a bruise or two, but this was noticeably more than the norm. She asked him what happened, and he started to say, "My dad got mad," and his little brother stepped in front of him and said, "No, you fell down the stairs, remember?" Older brother's eyes went wide, and he nodded and said he fell down the stairs. Mom called the deputy, who was a friend of my dad's and lived a few streets over. He came to our house and talked with my parents and promised to look into it. The boys stopped coming to our house. Mom, who grew up with an abusive father and divorced her abusive first husband, was heartbroken. My parents' house is next door to a small carryout, and sometimes in the evenings they would send me over there to get pops and chips for a snack. A few nights after she talked with the sheriff was one of those times. I walked out of our house, and the father of the boys was sitting on his front stoop. Understood that this was out of the ordinary for them. They had a huge deck in the back of their house with a much better view than he was getting looking at our small town's main street. It did not occur to me until years later that he was waiting to see me on one of my very regular trips to the store. He stood up and yelled my name and waited until he knew he had my attention. Then he proceeded to tell me to go get my mother, to tell her that if she wanted to call the cops on him, she could come out and face him and he'd give her something to call the cops about. It was surreal. I knew I should be scared, but I wasn't quite, just confused and honestly a little annoyed. Like, how dare he call my mom that, and he was delaying me getting chips and a pop? Like I said, I was 8. I went back into my house and told my parents. Dad stood up faster than I'd ever seen him move. Now, my dad is not a small man. He's 6'2" tall and at the time was about 280 pounds of the kind of muscle a man earns honestly by working in a steel fabrication shop and blacksmithing in his spare time. This was also something that didn't occur to me at that age. To me, it was handy that he was tall and strong so I could climb all over him and he could lift me up high to see cool stuff. My mom said his name in that particular way that wives do, and even though I was only 8, I knew there were paragraphs being said with that one syllable. Dad closed his eyes and took a deep breath and called the sheriff, who came back to our house and took another statement. By the time I had begun to understand how serious and scary all this was, and was only slightly calmed a little later when Dad went next door and got me a pop and some chips. I don't know exactly what the sheriff told the neighbor, but I heard that it was less related to laws and legal consequences and more about how large and angry my gun-owning dad might be about his wife and daughter getting threatened, and how, as the only officer in a 5-mile radius, the deputy himself might not always have the ability to respond to calls as quickly as he'd like. The family lived there for some years after that, and when they were old enough to cross the street by themselves, the boys would come over and play once in a while until they were all 3 old enough to know that the opposite gender was gross and full of cooties and not to be trusted. But their dad never dared even look our direction once from that night until the day they moved to another town. Good on your mom for making that call and not just writing off the older boy, and good on your dad for resisting the urge to give that guy what he honestly probably deserved. Probably for the better. The summer I was 17, I was recommended to babysit for this family with 2 young boys, 7/8 and 11/12. I showed up for my second day like I did the day before, and the mom left to go to work. The younger boy was arguing with the older boy because he wanted to play on his iPhone. The older one was telling him that he couldn't play. I thought we were alone in the house. All of a sudden, an angry large man walks down the stairs and starts yelling, "Hunter, give me your phone or I'm going to whoop you." I did not know that the dad was home. He came down without acknowledging me and whacked the younger boy so hard. I froze. I was scared he was going to hit me. He just had that angry look in his eyes. The dad never once introduced himself to me, and no one ever told me that the dad would be home. I almost called CPS once. I ended up telling the boy's friend's mom to watch out for them and explained what happened. She said that she had never met the dad. He never comes to the kids' soccer or baseball games. This isn't personal experience, but this was told by my friends. So we have FM equals friend's mom and C equals child. So friend's mom was a babysitter. She had constantly looked after one kid as their parents had a lot of work to do. One time, the child asked what consent was, and then friend's mom explains it all and everything. And at the end, friend's mom said it was okay to say no to intercourse. I think we can see where this is going, but just in case you don't, the child then said, even to family? If you are a parent who does this to your child, I wish nothing but the absolute worst upon you. Burn in hell, you monsters. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.